I've been in so many of these hearings, and my observation is that we have two constants that are part of this discussion. You go back for 50 years, we've never generated, other than a couple, 3 years in the Clinton administration, maybe a couple years, more than 17.5% of our GDP in federal revenues. I'm not going to ask each one of you, but would you agree with that statistic? Are you aware of it? Just a nod of your head would be fine. I think it is. I mean, it's black and white. The other thing that's a constant since the Bush years would be that we've been running chronic deficits. I think that's black and white too. Probably got started even back in the Reagan years when we did cut taxes and paid no attention to what we were going to do with spending. That makes perfect sense knowing how this place works. So, given that's a constant, and whenever you, I think, cut taxes, you're going to deplete Treasury revenues a little bit, years 1 and 2 following it. Your economic growth generally does a little better. That might be kind of that trade-off stubbornness of why revenues never get much beyond 17.5%. So regardless of what we do with offshore revenues, whatever we do here, it seems like we'd want to make this place work with the reality of what the economy is able to do. I'd like to start over with Dr. Klausing and then go across the board. And I want you to make a statement. Is it tax policy? That's a bigger issue now on our trillion-dollar deficits we generate every 6 months. When I got here, it was every year about 5 years ago. And is it tax policy or is it spending? And try to make sense with whatever your answer is that it doesn't violate that big statistic that we only generate 17.5% of our GDP and federal revenues. Dr. Klausing.
I think one thing we saw in the late 1990s when we did move towards better and better budget situation and ended up once with the surplus, I had to change all my class notes and describe that, well, the U.S. government can run a surplus, is that both taxes and spending are clearly important here. At the time that we ran that surplus, we got taxes relative to GDP more in the neighborhood of 20%. I don't think the 17.5 is an invaluable rule. That number does move around quite a bit.
Is 25% where we're currently at? What do you think of it? And that's occurred through COVID, through the present administration. When you look at spending at its current levels, it's closer to 25% of GDP. I didn't cite that earlier, but that's probably out there. You could never raise revenues to reach that level. Would you agree with that?
I have a proposal that suggests we should aim to reduce primary deficits by about half the size that they are now. I do think we have a huge gap between spending and taxation, and that's a problem, and it's one that Congress...
And you'd have to do that on the back of spending, just from the logic that we've been throwing around here.
I think taxes have an important role to play.
About half of it, you said.
In increasing the deficit, and I think people need to be able to compromise and address both sides of that equation.
Okay. Mr. Hausman.
Yes. Yes, to your question. I think, for the AFL-CIO and steelworkers, we see this idea that tax policy definitely has a major factor in how we address and improve the reduced deficit.
Up to what level? I agree it may
I think that if you're looking at a fact that in the current situation with all our foreign affairs issues that are going on right now, the fact that we have 12 aircraft carriers that need to be out there patrolling our seas, ensuring that safe transit of goods across the global economy, that we have to ensure that there may be revenue necessary to raise to ensure that safety and security.
And I think everybody would say that's a generally statement that you can categorically disagree with, but put it in the context of running $2 trillion deficits annually.
Well, I think if you raise revenue to help reduce that deficit level, you're going to improve that overall outcome.
So you're with Dr. Klausing there a little bit, maybe 50-50.
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the tax revenue shrinkage since the passage of the Trump tax law. I've seen estimates anywhere from 1 to 2 trillion. I defer to the experts.
It's 150 billion a year, which would be a very small percentage of our current $2 trillion deficits. I acknowledge that. Other than the CBO, right before COVID was showing that that was almost neutralized. So take that into consideration too, but I'll grant you what is real, 150 billion per year, which is a small percentage of 2 trillion.
Well, I believe there's been estimates if the Trump tax law was continued for an additional 10 years, it could be as much as a $4 trillion gap. So my only point is that tax revenue has come down, and certainly not.
And that would kind of make sense if you're doubling the time frame, but it's still percentage-wise the small part of our current borrowing and spending.
Well,
I think I'm right there on the numbers, and I agree with you that if you double the time span, it would be closer to 3 billion to 4, or 3 trillion to 4 trillion.
I guess my answer to the question is that right now, given the sort of reduction in tax revenue versus, have we continued before, that is more of a tax issue right now than it is a spending issue.
Well, then I'd say you're saying 7.5% to 15% of the deficit, which you've just blamed on the Trump tax cuts. That's a much, much smaller figure than where the balance of that deficit's coming from. Dr. Hines.
Senator Braun, we've got 3 colleagues waiting in
Yes.
line. If
Just, you want to go real quickly, just to...
As Senator Braun, I completely agree with you that the deficit is a huge problem and we need to do something about it. Your question was, and obviously you can either cut spending or you can raise taxes or some combination. Your question was, is it possible to conceive of taxing, say, 25% of the national income? There are countries that do it, like France. And if you want to have the economy of France, you can have their policies. But that's what you get, is, an economy like France's, which is much less affluent than ours.
Thank you. Ms. Hirschfeld.
Yeah, I think if you're addicted to spending, no amount of revenues will be able to make.
I'd say you hit it right on the head. Thank you.